Those speakers unlinked.
Okay, can you hear me? Testing 1, 2, 3. Awesome. I affirm the resolution that social media giants like Twitter and Facebook should censor violent groups like Antifa or the alt-right. Let's get to some definitions. First, to censor means to mute or to silence. In the context of social media, this means that they would have some sort of terms of service that say you're not allowed to openly advocate for violence on our site. And if they're not willing to change their speech, they'd be removed from it. That's what censoring means in this context. Violent groups, we already have 2 examples, but these would be groups that practice and advocate for the direct behavior of harm towards other people. A quick res analysis before we dive in. You can remember this as free speech is irrelevant. Now, free speech is an issue that's very politically charged and controversial, and there might be a temptation to bring it up in this debate, but let's remember what free speech is. Free speech is where the government decides whether or not it's legal to have X opinion. It's where the government is preventing you from speaking and saying something, not when a private company like a social media institution is deciding whether or not you can use certain language on their site. Let's step down into the weighing mechanism you can remember as the right of control. Now, the only reasonable way to determine if social media giants should censor violent groups is whether or not they have the authority and the right to control what stuff is on their site. This would be the same thing as saying that if you have a group of people over that you haven't met before, one of them turns out to be an advocate of ISIS, you're not entitled, you're not obligated, to keep him at your table because it is your table. It's your house, and therefore it's your rules. Obviously, you can't use your rules to harm other people, but in the context of someone else using their speech, you don't have to let your private home and private residence be a platform for someone else's terrible ideologies. Let's step into my one main argument, and that's that businesses have the right. Now, businesses own themselves. So the first reason that this resolution is true is that it is an extension of their own property. That because social media giants, although we recognize them as institutions that are popular in public, they are still private companies and they own themselves. Thus, they have a right to determine what kind of content is on their site because it's exactly their property. Think about this. You wouldn't be obligated to use your business institutions if you own one to support ideas that personally disgust you. You don't have to do that because we live in a free country. The second argument is private resources. Playing off the same remark, there's no reason to suggest that a company that owns itself must support and must allow for ideas that are hateful, vindictive, and even violent. We're not just talking about like petty ideas that people don't like. We're talking about the advocacy and promotion of violence. So this resolution, were it true, would extend to other groups as well, like ISIS or terrorism. We don't have to allow private resources to be used to support these kinds of behaviors.
All right, yeah, cool. So I like that we're getting the legal stuff out of the way first because that always comes up in this debate, and it's a little bit irritating. But first thing is that regulating opinions is always subjective, and that's what you're getting into when you talk about political groups like Antifa or the alt-right. So when you get into the opinion-making stuff, deciding what group to ban, it gets dicey. I mean, for instance, the alt-right is a super nebulous term, and that gets thrown at all sorts of people as a way of shutting them down. There's not a single conservative page on Facebook that isn't accused of being alt-right, at least sometimes. And actual alt-right pages will use the fact that they get censored all the time as a selling point. I mean, after all, if somebody in authority is telling you you shouldn't read something, don't you get a little curious as to what it is? Personally, I always click on the photos that Facebook puts that warning filter on. Antifa is a way more defined group, but they still have every right to speak. And as we covered, this is not a First Amendment thing, all right? Now, that does help in America. In Europe, people get arrested all the time for a tweet or a Facebook post, right? Especially in Germany, also in the UK and a few other countries. First Amendment. Now, that's where the government comes in. But I think we're talking more about the platforms themselves, and we'll kind of hopefully keep this to America, but use Europe as a bit of caution here. And even in America, the truth is people don't care about the Constitution or legal definitions. The Constitution says I have the right to bear arms, but I don't have that right because I live in Hawaii. It doesn't practically happen. Culture decides what rights we have way more than the law does. And there's no law that says Facebook has to publish anything. But if you cut access to social media, here in the year 2017, it's how we talk. And you can't exclude unpopular opinions from that because it's a bigger deal than, say, stopping somebody from passing out pamphlets on the street that these First Amendment cases have focused on in the past. It will not be up to the government to give people free speech on the internet, all right? It's going to be up to the people who use the internet, people like you and me. So that's why I find it funny to be arguing in favor of censorship on these major websites or platforms. It's the least cool opinion I've heard since like warning labels on CDs, man. I'm going to toss it back to you with 30 seconds left.
Okay, so just to be really blunt, I'm not really seeing anything out of the last speech that should give you a reason to vote con. We've heard some discussions about how this could be annoying to us, how sometimes social media companies can be irrational, but we haven't addressed the core issue that it's their right and it's their own business. Therefore, there's all the reason in the world to vote pro, even before I respond to this. But I will. First, he says regulation is subjective. My response is subjective right. This is a term. Of course it's subjective. If you have your house, it's your subjective right to decide whether or not you're going to allow someone who supports ISIS to eat at your dinner table. Next, he says, well, pretty much all conservative pages will get targeted because there's not really a difference between the alt-right and conservatism. This is actually not true. Richard Spencer was the founder of the alt-right movement. Wikipedia, I know it's weird to use Wikipedia around, but it's probably the easiest one that we can find. There's a meaningful difference here. Wikipedia defines the difference as the alt-right is a loosely defined political group that rejects traditional conservatism for white nationalism. And that's exactly what Richard Spencer is on for. So I think we can see that there's a difference between Ted Cruz and Richard Spencer. You may both hate them, but there's a difference. Let's not say that they're all the same and just every conservative ideology is going to get axed. The second thing is violence. The key word in the resolution is violent groups. So we're not just talking about any group in the world. We're talking about groups that advocate for violence. Lastly, he says Antifa has the right to speak. My response is, sure, that's a free speech issue, not on the social media. My second response is reject violence on social media. If you allow something to be put on social media consistently, especially for these companies, barring the fact it's their right, and no matter what my opponent says, he will not be able to disprove that, there's legitimate reasons why they should be allowed to. Disseminating violence to lots of people is a good way to radicalize other individuals. It's a good way to make terrorism more organized. It's an easier way to communicate. Why would we willingly allow violent groups the ease of access to communicate and plot more terrorism? I mean, we just saw a terrorist attack, presumably, at least we're assuming it's a terrorist attack, yesterday in New York. And we're standing here saying, well, we don't really want to, hurt their feelings. We want to allow them to get their opinions out. Like, come on, these are violent groups. Why would we give them a platform to speak? Last thing he says is companies deciding that might get yucky. My response is, I'm okay with banning violence. I would never be like, well, shucks, I guess we should allow ISIS and Antifa and every group that supports violence to just have their say, because otherwise you never know if my last tweet's going to get removed. I don't care about that. The resolution is asking if social media giants should get rid of violence, should censor violent groups. And the answer is absolutely. Violence is bad, should never be supported. And these social media giants are privately owned businesses that have all the right in the world to do what they want.
Okay, the debate isn't does social media have the right to censor these groups? All right, we both agree that they do, so I don't want to keep harping on that. But it's should they censor these groups? And what I'm saying is it's subjective what groups are considered violent. I hear things all the time like language is violence. This is actually taught to me in school, which is a sort of a strange thought, but it's caught on among many people, and they use it to censor the internet. So your definition of violence, just punching some dude in the mouth or whatever, we probably are on the same page there, but everyone isn't, and that's used to shut things down, and it's used exactly in the sense we're talking about. First Amendment set aside. We agree on all things legal. Now, we get into opinions about, you brought up a terrorist group, which is, I think, a little different than Antifa or the alt-right, and of course, people on both those sides will have issues with that, but that's straight up, nobody disagrees, terrorist group. Anybody should be able to say things like, fuck America, hope it burns to the ground. I hate that shit, but you could argue it's violent, and it is to me, but it's a little bit different than, say, recruiting or organizing for actual violent things. And that's illegal in any country. That's not a matter of speech. That's a matter of violence and law. These things are all covered. So I don't see that as a censorship thing. All right. And in practice, Facebook and Twitter don't do very well at the censorship game. And I think that's the big issue here, because it's just lumping one group in with another. And I want to be clear that with lumping groups, I didn't say there was no difference between conservatives and the alt-right. I'm very much aware of that. It was not my point. My point is that people say there is no difference between conservatives and the alt-right, and that's used to censor a bunch of people. Thus, we have the problem. I mean, take the recent past as an example. There was an article published in that Gizmodo, the technology magazine online, that had directly from Facebook employees how they favor based on their own personal politics. Let me find the quote for you. Here's what a Facebook employee says. It's absolutely biased. We were doing it subjectively. It just depends on who the curator is and what time of day it is. There's the problem with censorship. It's up to just some guy. It's his opinion. Is he going to say the alt-right is violent and Antifa isn't, or vice versa? We run into problems very quickly.
I'm actually going to begin with his second argument because it's so important to mention. His chief argument here is essentially violence is subjective, which impacted out to the res would say, well, because some person might loosely define violence, censorship might get out of control and then be a problem. So we still haven't addressed the overarching issue that he has no way to say that that's a bad thing because he's already conceded that they have a right to do that. It's their own institution, so wherever you enter the debate round, remember my opponent has already conceded that. But let's get down to my two responses. My first is the definition. Definitions are there to provide meaning to words. So if my opponent's saying it's subjective, no, it's not. I already gave you a definition, which, as I said, is the advocacy and promotion and practice of direct harm to other people. I mean, for gosh sake, guys, there are a lot of subjective things in the world. Take a philosophy class a time or two, and I can tell you that not everything in life is black and white. But good golly, violence is about as black and white as it gets, guys. Stabbing someone in the back is not really a matter of opinion. Socrates isn't sitting back like, well, you know, is my arm really cut off and bleeding, or is it just simply a dream within a dream? Like for gosh sake, we love to always bring out these subjective arguments as if they're like the end-all be-all. But like, good grief, this is freaking violence. Nothing gets more obvious than violence. A group that steps forward, commits acts of terrorism, you know, attacks other people, punches them in the face. Can we not like have any moment of concession and be like, okay, yeah, I guess that's violence? Are we seriously going to pretend that we can't understand anything in the world? So my response is first, no. Heck no, violence is not subjective. Violence is obvious. Second is the definition. We already gave it. My opponent can't in the debate round say it's subjective when we've defined it. The third is the logical implication. Just take the implication of what my opponent's saying. If he's saying we shouldn't censor because violence is this mystical thing and we can never pin it down, then we shouldn't have any laws against violence either. Because what if our lawmakers in another country step forward and say, well, you know, violence means liking lollipops, so we're going to make that illegal too, and then all the laws become communistic and out of control. Like, if my opponent's going to say that violence is actually subjective, he should oppose all restrictions on violence for the same reasons, that they can get regressive and out of control, because what even is violence anyway? So to end this debate, I would like to go back up to his first argument of where he concedes that they have the right. Two things. First is white flag. At the moment, my opponent is willing to concede that companies are completely justified. It is utterly their right, in the same way that it's your house, you can kick out the ISIS advocate, to censor this. There's no way for you to vote con. How can you say, no, they shouldn't, when it's absolutely their business to do so? The other two things are violence bad. Yes, if my opponent and I both don't like violence and we agree that violence is measurable and knowable, then why on earth should they allow it to be on their site? Good reason. The other reason is private resources. If this personally disgusts the company, why should they be forced to use their private resources to support it? I think we have plenty of reasons to vote pro.
Okay, we both agree what violence is. That's, people don't. Like, you and me, I think, are pretty level-headed in the subject. But in general, a lot of folks aren't, all right? So that leads to trouble. I'm talking about the practical implications of censoring people on social media. There is a massive bias toward conservative thought censorship on social media as opposed to liberal. Now, maybe in a few years, it'll be the other way around. It doesn't really matter. But the excuse always starts with violence. We've got to censor violence. We have every law in place. You're not illegally allowed to threaten anybody, all right, to say you're going to do damage to their body and all this. So leave that to the law enforcement, okay? On Facebook, there is whatever community standards they want to have. Yes, again, no one's disputing the right to have whatever they want to do on their own platform. It's not a First Amendment thing. I covered that first. That's not part of this con argument. We're talking about whether they should really let all thought flow on the internet. Because while it's not great to threaten people, And it doesn't happen very often. When it does, then the law can go and look up the post and say, hey, you did this. Not so much if it's deleted, right? It's not anything we need more rules for, because in practice, it only penalizes those that are talking about other things, and they get lumped in with violence.
Okay, the quick response here is my opponent's conceding almost every argument on the flow, and the only thing he's come back to is to say that CEOs are morons and don't know what violence is. Two responses. First, debate definitions matter most. The definitions we provide in this debate round give you a framework for understanding concepts. It's fruitless to say, well, your definition is fine, and I agree to it, but you never know. Some CEO out there might have no idea what violence is and might discuss this resolution in a different way. I'm not really concerned with what some hypothetical CEO in a magical universe might do. I'm concerned with what the resolution says and what we've agreed to. We've agreed that violence is the direct harm to other people. My opponent has also agreed that social media giants own their own companies and are allowed to do whatever the heck they want with their terms of use. So if we agree that violence is bad and it shouldn't exist, then there's no other party in this debate round that's asking you to vote con. Both of us have said we hate violence. Both of us have said that social media institutions are allowed to run their own business. Both of us don't support violence, and I'm pretty sure don't support the dissemination of it. So where on earth are we getting any advocacy for us to vote con? The second thing is slippery slope. This is literally the links that my opponent is giving you. He's saying, well, some CEO might use a different definition. This different definition might encroach on some sort of legitimate speech issue. Then this might create another series of bad rules that might get really restrictive. Thus, to heck with all censorship of violence. Let's just let anyone say whatever they want. I mean, beyond this being completely unfounded, like he has no examples of some CEO that considers favoriting a tweet about Tic Tacs to be violence. He has no evidence that CEOs are total morons that don't know what the concepts are. Like, this is just a baseless argument. We don't support violence. We don't want it on sites. We don't want organizations of it. So why on earth should we allow it to be spoken?
Okay, I'm not saying might. I'm saying does. This is all about in practice. And I'm not saying CEOs either. This is how it actually works. There's these low-level jobs that lead to the actual Facebook censorship. Now, I'll get all this from The Guardian in case you ask for a source later. They have these listings of an annual salary of about $23,000, all right? More in some places like in America and much less in places like the Philippines. And they got about 4,500 people that just comb through the Facebook content and decide what gets banned and what doesn't. What it works out to is about 10 seconds per thing to make a decision. And yeah, it leads to a lot of bullshit. Okay, this is the problem with censorship. It's inherent. I get Facebook banned for just innocuous stuff. I mean, it happens to me. I'll get banned for sharing a post, but the post I shared is not found to be anything problem. A big thing that happens is people report my stuff as spam because they don't like me or what I say, but I'm not selling anything. This is all censorship, all right? And when you use the violence as a starting point, it erodes from there. So yes, the slippery slope, abso-fucking-lutely.
I mean, the quick response is that the resolution is about violence, not about petty opinions or arbitrary political thought. The resolution is so freaking obvious that social media giants should censor violent groups. So my opponent can complain all he wants about, maybe someday down the road it'll start with violence and then they'll just, start hating all thought. But I mean, that, like, I can give you arguments here. Like, I can give you positions such as that, destroying an entire wing of political thought would be really economically damaging to social media sites because then they wouldn't have half as many users as before. Like, I can give you economic analysis and win these positions, but it doesn't matter. Like, the debate is literally over, guys. At the moment, my opponent is saying, yes, I hate violence. Yes, social media companies own themselves and can do whatever the heck they want. But we should allow violence because you never know. Stopping violence might lead to other things. Like, the analysis is just baseless. There's nothing here.
It's not up to social media to stop violence. That's a totally separate legal issue. And again, I don't want to keep going back to who has the right. I acknowledge they have the right. The argument is, should they censor? The answer is no. And I'm talking about, again, in practice. This has already happened. This isn't a hypothetical that they censor something and call it, oh, violence. No, this happens all the time. This is used usually on the right. And I think given enough years, it could easily switch back to being used on the left. It's about protecting what everybody has to say. The slippery slope is so slippery, it's happening now.
Okay, my response is, bruh, Antifa is leftist. the resolution isn't just talking about right-wing violence. It's talking about violence. Read the resolution again.
I know. I'm saying they favor the right currently. I'm sure it happens to the left sometimes, but overall, this is being used toward one direction. I'm also saying that it could go either way. It really depends who works at that company. All right. I don't know of any right-wing social media platforms, but this is the condition we have now. So when you have any sort of censorship, it only grows because the people who are for it tend to like to control other stuff. It just goes that way. It happens every time.
So this just isn't true. Twitter already shuts down ISIS accounts on the daily, but you're still allowed to speak your political ideas.
There's a ton of people that get shut down on Twitter who are not ISIS and have legitimate political opinions. I mean, Twitter is notorious for that. These lists of what's allowed on these codes of conduct just grow longer all the time. I mean, they come to agreements with different countries so that it gets even divided by what nationality are, what you can post. There's special rules on Facebook for Pakistan, Russia, Turkey, China, Germany. This is the problem with censorship. Anything you can write on there has plenty of legal precedent for wherever you're at to punish you if it's a violent threat, all right? But writing it down in a book, yelling it on the street, or typing it on a computer, it's pick what you want. You have the right.
Nick, so if you ran Twitter, you would do away with the policy that shut down ISIS Twitter accounts?
No, ISIS is, well, let's say this. If ISIS had accounts at ISIS Pakistan, right, and they were saying, blah, 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 yeah, come join ISIS. It's super cool. No, I would say in the interest of free speech, don't shut that down. Now, when the intelligence agencies track down that account and drone them, I will chuckle. But it's, as a free speech issue, it's its own thing.
So just to be clear, you would support keeping ISIS Twitter accounts valid, open, and free. You'd be cool with that.
Yeah, on Twitter, if you want to say I'm for this, ISIS is the sweetest thing ever, you have the right to be pro-ISIS. Now, when you start threatening people and say I want to blow up the New York Bridge, that's a bit different. That's a terroristic threat. Okay, that's what law enforcement handles.
Okay, I'm not really sure how to respond to this. My opponent has taken almost every position possible for con and even some for pro. First, no, we should not allow ISIS to be on Twitter because we know that when ISIS is on Twitter, they're going to be organizing violence. My opponent's saying, well, we'll stop them at the moment they yell out an angry tweet. Why give them the chance? Why allow them to slide into other, I know this sounds like millennial slang, but like for real, this is how it happens, that people on social media, advocates of these violent groups, will organize violence. My opponent is saying that, you know, he steps into Twitter day one, the biggest change he makes, don't increase the character limit or do stuff that people want, like just make ISIS freer, because that's what's wrong with America, that violent groups aren't able to be as free as they want to. I'm sorry to be condescending here, but like, we have to acknowledge like how reductive this argument is. He already says it's not a free speech issue, and then the only reason he gives you to support ISIS being freer is free speech, which doesn't even make sense because ISIS doesn't have the right to organize violence. That's like literally, you're not allowed to do that, even under the law, and much less an owner of a social media institution never has the obligation to support that. So let's condense this real quick. I know we had kind of a sidebar, an interchange. Here's what the debate's coming down to. My opponent doesn't support violence, but supports making ISIS freer. That makes no bloody sense. My opponent says the social media giants have the right to control their business, but says, no, they should use their private resources to allow ideas that disgust them to continually reappear. He says, well, it's not a free speech issue, but make ISIS freer because free speech. There's contradictions on almost every single argument in this debate round, and I think your decision is easy.
No, they don't have to like what's on their platform. I'm saying that if you're going to really allow free speech and have something based on that, which maybe they choose not to, all right, that's not the hypothetical. It's should we censor on the internet, okay? So yes, in that sense, anybody should be able to say things. Now, no one's supporting ISIS or saying that violence is good. That's not what's going on here. Your simple right to express any opinion, though, should be protected.
Okay, the speech doesn't need to be longer than 5 seconds. My opponent has repeatedly said that this is not about free speech, and yet is talking about civil rights and free speech. This is just a total contradiction.
Because yes, the First Amendment, right, that protects you. A business is different. They can allow what they want. I get that, okay? But when you have, in practice, who's really allowed to talk, that becomes a concern, right? The First Amendment covers you writing a book. No one has to publish it. But when you have whole swaths of opinion that can't see the light of day, this becomes a free speech issue. Not in the First Amendment legal sense, but in the sense that we're not hearing stuff, right? It's being banned effectively. And it's not about ISIS, so let's not keep reducing it to that. It's about unpopular opinions, and they are called violent, right? That is the excuse to ban them.
My big voting issue is the resolution versus Khan's resolution. My opponent has twisted the res to say opinions that social media institutions don't like should be censored, but that's not the topic. The topic is that social media giants should censor violent groups. My opponent has not said, he dropped the violence is subjective argument as soon as we responded because it wasn't strong enough to hold up. He's gone back and said that violence, can be interpreted different ways, but we've already dealt with that. And the only resolution he can cling on to is one that doesn't exist. It's one that we haven't written and haven't debated. We're not talking about any opinion. We're talking about violent groups, right or left.
Right. We both agree what violence is, but other people don't. That's why it's subjective. And they use it as an excuse repeatedly. This happens all the time, right? It's on college campuses. You'll hear all the time, words are violence. Somebody preaches this. The alt-right says they want to have a place just for white folks. Therefore, that's violent to other groups, right? But words can't be violence. And that is the big thought that's being pushed, and that's the big danger in censoring social media. More than just, I'm going to go punch Billy in the nose tomorrow at 3. See the difference?
Yes, but I also see the resolution, which says violent groups like Antifa or the alt-right. So the resolution is giving us the context of acts of violence, not simply words. And it also doesn't stigmatize just the right as you claim. It's talking about right or left.
Right. Okay. Right or left. But it's explicitly say right or left. But let's go with that because one of them is on the right and one of them is on the left. Okay. Now it's making the presumption that Antifa is violent. Now I think there's plenty of evidence that they are. I would call them a violent group, but a lot of people on the left wouldn't. All right. The alt-right has had its violent moments, but I think people on the right would argue against that as well. Okay. So this is where the subjective nature of it comes in. You're going to get into matters of opinion, and you're going to censor people that don't deserve it. All right? We don't like violence, but guess what? This isn't going to stop anything actually violent from happening.
So there's 2 debaters, and both of them have agreed what violence is. So don't use and don't pretend that some other institution out there exists in this debate and is making a different argument about violence. My opponent's not going to support it, so there's no reason to vote for it.
There is another institution. It's the social media companies that we're talking about have their own definition, right? And that plenty of things get censored. Okay, if you and me, fine, we can be level-headed about it. I'm telling you, people aren't in practice. I think you really believe that. That's the thing. Like, there's some absolutely insane censorship on Facebook and Twitter, right? And this is all in the interest of making a less violent world. Well, I don't think it's working, and I think that this is simply an excuse to censor people, not violent groups. That's just where it starts, and that's why we have to protect every point.
So we've just covered every argument of the flow, and we're making circles. The slippery slope argument of censoring violence and censoring every Twitter shuts down ISIS. You're still allowed to express your opinions. We've covered the issue on violence. We already agree what violence is, so who cares what someone else disagrees on? I agree that there's other people, but we're the only debaters. We're the object of persuasion, and if both of us agree what a word means, it's meaningless to say, oh, I know what violence is, and I agree what it is for the purpose of the debate, but hypothetically, someone else might not. That makes no sense. There's no reason for you to vote Khan if he's agreed to the definition.
While I would love for people to be as rational as us about what violence is, that doesn't play into it, and we have to go with the title of the debate here. Social media giants should censor violent groups. They are the ones that really are going to set the tone of what violence is because they're in charge of it for the purpose of this debate, not you or me, and they aren't doing a very good job. All right, my time's up. Adios, pal.
And the key thing we come down to is context. The groups of violence like Antifa are the context that we desperately need and the res gives us. Don't support violence and don't support freedom for it.